I've always had this weird fascination with Christmas. Not just the day itself, don't get me wrong, I love the gifts and all, but the whole vibe of it. The lights, the decorations, the music that loops endlessly in malls. I've always felt like Christmas had this magic to it, even if it's a bit over the top. So when I landed a part-time gig at a Christmas-themed store for the holiday season, I thought, this is perfect. Let me tell you, it wasn't exactly my dream job or anything. I'm not one of those super bubbly customer service types who greets every person like they're an old friend. But hey, it was a job and it came with perks, discounts on those ridiculously overpriced decorations and flexible hours. Plus, I'm more of a night owl, so the late shifts didn't bother me. In fact, I kind of liked the idea of closing up the store by myself. It sounded peaceful, Quiet time to wind down, surrounded by glittery ornaments and fake snow. The store was your typical over-the-top Christmas wonderland. You know the type. It had these aisles packed with everything you can think of. Ornaments shaped like tacos, candy canes the size of your arm, and enough twinkling lights to blind someone. There was even this life-sized animatronic Santa near the entrance that sang a song every time someone walked by. It was cute at first, but by the second week, I couldn't stand that thing. It always seemed like it was watching me, even when it wasn't moving. Creepy, right? Anyway, I'd been working there for a couple of weeks when my manager, Lisa, asked if I could cover the late shift on Christmas Eve. Yeah, I know, weird name for a day, but that's what she called it. Apparently, the regular closer had called in sick, and I was the only one available. I didn't mind. I thought it might even be nice, no customers, no distractions. Just me, the decorations, and maybe a hot cocoa if I could sneak one from the staff room. That night, the mall felt different. Have you ever been in a shopping mall after it's closed? Strange. The place that's usually buzzing with people, full of noise and energy, suddenly feels like an empty shell. All the lights are dimmed except for the ones in our store, and the echoes of your footsteps feel way too loud. It's hard to explain, but the air just feels heavier when you're there alone. Still, I brushed it off. I mean, it's just a mall, right? No big deal. I unlocked the door to the store, turned on the lights, and settled in for what I thought was going to be an uneventful shift. My checklist for the night was simple. Restock the shelves, clean up the display tables, and lock up by midnight. Easy stuff. While I was restocking one of the ornament aisles, I started to notice how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that makes you feel like something's missing. The background hum of the mall was completely gone. No faint music from the overhead speakers. No sounds of the janitor's machines cleaning the floors. Just silence. It was so quiet I could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I laughed at myself a little. You're just tired, I thought. Stop overthinking it. But then I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved, quick and small, just at the edge of one of the aisles. Probably just the display swaying or something. I mumbled to myself, trying to sound casual even though no one was there to hear me. I ignored it and went back to stacking the ornaments, but I couldn't shake that feeling, like someone was watching me. When I glanced over at the animatronic Santa by the entrance, I swear, for just a split second, its head seemed tilted in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't singing its annoying jingle, it was just there, staring straight ahead, still as a statue. I told myself I was being silly. It's just a prop, I thought. I even walked over and gave it a little nudge. Nothing happened, of course. It was just plastic and wires. But something about the way its glassy eyes caught the light made my skin crawl. I hurried back to the aisle I'd been working on, suddenly feeling very aware of how alone I was. By the time I finished restocking, it was nearly 11. Just one more hour, I told myself. Then I could go home, curl up in bed, and laugh at how jumpy I'd been. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps. Not the steady click of mall security making their rounds, but soft, uneven steps. Closer, then further, like someone was pacing in the dark. I froze. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, soft but deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the mall. It wasn't loud enough to pinpoint exactly, but it wasn't distant enough to ignore. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Maybe it was just a security guard making their rounds or one of the mall's cleaners working overtime. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. Gripping the edge of the counter, I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. The silence crept back in, thicker than before, and for a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "You're just tired," I whispered, trying to reassure myself. I turned back to the ornaments I'd been sorting, but my hands felt clumsy now, my movements jerky. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing it was just a message. Pulling it out of my pocket, I saw a text from Lisa, my manager. The timestamp read 11:15 p.m. "Hey, forgot to mention, there's a list of closing rules taped to the register. Follow them exactly. No exceptions. Text me if you have questions." That was weird. Lisa wasn't exactly the all-caps type, and why would closing rules need such emphasis? I chuckled nervously, half expecting her next message to be a joke. But none came. Curious, and honestly a little uneasy, I walked over to the front counter and found the paper she mentioned. It was an ordinary piece of paper, the kind you'd find in a cheap office printer, taped to the underside of the cash register. The text was handwritten, the letters blocky and a little smudged, like they'd been scrawled in a hurry. The title read, "Closing Procedures. Do not ignore." Underneath it, a list of rules stretched down the page. Some seemed normal enough at first glance, but the further I read, the more unsettling they became. The rules. Double-check that the front door is locked by 11:30 p.m. If it's unlocked after this time, do not lock it. Leave immediately and call the store manager. Avoid looking directly at the animatronic Santa between 11:45 p.m. and 12 a.m. If you hear someone knocking on the front door after 11:50 p.m., do not open it or respond. If you notice any decorations have been moved, put them back in their original place without delay. At exactly 12 a.m., turn off all lights, leave the store immediately, and do not look back. I stared at the paper, my pulse quickening. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe Lisa was messing with me, trying to make the late shift a little more interesting. But her earlier text didn't feel like a joke. I mean, why the urgency? And why would she tell me to follow these rules exactly? For a second, I considered calling her. But then I remembered how Lisa could get. She hated being disturbed late at night. "Don't be that person," I muttered to myself, though my voice felt hollow. I read the list again, slower this time, my eyes lingering on rule number 3. If you hear someone knocking, do not open it or respond. Why would anyone knock on the door of a closed store at nearly midnight? And why specifically after 11:50? I tried to shake off the growing unease and focus on finishing my shift. The logical part of my brain told me the list was nonsense. But another part, the one that couldn't explain the footsteps I'd heard earlier, wasn't so sure. As the minutes ticked by, the store seemed to change. The decorations felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that didn't seem quite right. A string of lights flickered overhead, though I could have sworn they'd been fine earlier. A row of nutcracker figurines on the shelf seemed slightly out of place, like one of them had been bumped forward. And then there was the animatronic Santa. I hadn't paid much attention to it since that weird moment earlier, but now I couldn't ignore the way its glassy eyes seemed to catch the faintest light, reflecting it like they were alive. I glanced at my watch. 11:43 p.m. Almost time for one of the rules to kick in, the one about not looking directly at Santa between 11:45 and 12 o'clock. My chest tightened as I stared at the clock on the wall. The seconds seemed to drag, each one slower than the last. Finally, the clock struck 11:45. I exhaled sharply and forced myself to move to the next aisle. It's just a prop, I reminded myself. Just wires and plastic. But even as I told myself that, I avoided looking in its direction. Around 11:50, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock at the front door. My stomach dropped. No way, no way. The knock came again, louder this time. I froze in place, my hands gripping the edge of a shelf. I couldn't see the door from where I stood, but I could feel its presence, like it was drawing me toward it. "Don't answer," I whispered, the words barely audible. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was outside clearly wanted to be let in. I thought about the rule. Do not open it or respond. For a split second, I considered breaking it just to see who was there. But something deep inside me screamed not to. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. It stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until the sound of my own breathing felt deafening. I glanced at my watch again. 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes until midnight. 5 minutes until I could shut everything down and leave. I decided to distract myself by tidying up the nutcracker display. I reached out to adjust one of them when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the nutcrackers, the one I'd swear had been on the far right earlier, was now in the center of the shelf. I backed away, my heart pounding. No one else was here. I was sure of it. So how did it move? The answer came to me, unbidden and terrifying. I didn't follow the rule. If you notice any decorations have been moved, put them back in their original place without delay. I hesitated, unsure if touching it would make things better or worse. But the rule was clear, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ignored it. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached out and moved the nutcracker back to its original spot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint hum of the animatronic Santa coming to life. The clock struck midnight. The chime of the mall clock hitting midnight rang faintly through the quiet. I stood frozen in place, staring at the nutcracker I had just returned to its spot. For a moment, everything was still, and I almost let myself believe that whatever tension had been building would dissolve into nothing. Then, the hum of the animatronic Santa broke the silence. It wasn't singing its usual jingle. Instead, the sound it made was low, mechanical, and broken, like someone had pressed play on an old cassette tape that kept skipping. A whirring noise followed, and my chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just the sound. It was moving. I couldn't bring myself to turn around right away. My back was to the entrance, and all I could do was listen as the sound of its slow, jerky movements grew louder. In the corner of my vision, I caught a glimpse of something shifting near the door. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep still, I turned to look. There it was. The Santa was no longer by the entrance. It had shuffled several feet closer to the aisles, its head tilted slightly downward as if it had been studying the floor. My breath caught in my throat. "No way," I whispered. "No way this is happening." I backed up a step, bumping into the shelf behind me. My hand hit a row of ornaments, and one tumbled to the ground with a soft clink. The Santa's head jerked upward. It didn't move like it should have, smooth and robotic like a normal animatronic. Instead, the movement was sharp and unnatural, like something had pushed it too hard. I couldn't look away, my eyes locked on its unblinking plastic stare. Then, just as suddenly as it had started moving, it stopped. I forced myself to take a shaky breath. Follow the rules, I thought. Just stick to the rules. The paper taped under the register had been clear. At midnight, turn off the lights and leave the store. Don't look back. I grabbed my bag and fumbled for the light switch near the entrance, my fingers trembling as I flipped it off. Darkness swallowed the store. Only the faint glow of the emergency exit sign remained, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I forced myself to walk steadily toward the door, but my legs felt weak, like I might collapse at any moment. I made it outside, locking the door behind me as quickly as I could. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small rush of relief the moment I stepped into the empty mall corridor. The silence was unnerving, but at least I was out of that store, or so I thought. As I began walking toward the mall's main exit, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement on one of the security monitors mounted near the ceiling. I stopped, squinting at the screen. The monitors were small and grainy, showing black and white feeds from various parts of the mall. Most of them were empty, showing dimly lit hallways and dark storefronts. But one screen wasn't empty. It showed the inside of the Christmas store. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just rows of shelves and displays, all still and lifeless. But then, in the far corner of the frame, a shadow moved. My stomach churned as I watched the figure step into view. It was tall, with broad shoulders and a distorted shape, like it wasn't quite human. Its movements were slow but deliberate, and even though I was staring at a screen, I felt like its presence was pressing against me. The figure stopped in the middle of the store, right in front of the animatronic Santa. For a moment, it seemed like they were looking at each other. Then the Santa moved again. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my bag. The hallway around me felt darker, like the shadows were closing in. "Get out," I whispered to myself. "Just get out." I forced myself to keep walking, but my steps were uneven. Every sound in the empty mall seemed amplified. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the echo of my own footsteps, even the rustle of my clothes felt too loud. And then I heard something else. Footsteps. They were slow at first, distant, but they grew louder with each passing second. I froze, my breath catching as I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway behind me was empty. "Hello," I called out, though I wasn't sure why. The word came out shaky, barely above a whisper. No response. I picked up my pace, practically jogging toward the exit now. But the footsteps didn't stop. They followed me, steady and relentless, always just out of sight. I finally reached the main doors of the mall and pushed against them, expecting the cold rush of night air to greet me. But they didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the doors wouldn't move. My pulse raced as I looked around for another way out. That's when I noticed the clock above the doors. It was stuck at 12 o'clock. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I was trapped. I backed away from the doors, my eyes darting around the darkened mall. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. A soft knock echoed through the hallway. It was coming from the direction of the Christmas store. My throat tightened as I turned toward the sound. There, at the far end of the hallway, was the store's glass entrance. The animatronic Santa was standing right behind the glass, its hand raised as if it had been the one knocking. But it wasn't alone. Standing just behind it was the figure I'd seen on the security monitor. Its features were impossible to make out in the dim light, but its presence was unmistakable, towering, unnerving, and wrong. They were both just standing there, perfectly still, staring at me. I don't know how long I stood frozen in place, my body refusing to move. Felt like time itself had stopped. And then the knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty mall. I didn't stop until I reached the service hallway, a narrow corridor meant for staff use. The air was colder here, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of what was happening. All I knew was one thing: I had to survive the night. The air in the service hallway was freezing, and every breath I took felt sharp and shallow. My back pressed against the cold wall, and my ears strained for any sound. I'd run as fast as I could, but I didn't know if it was far enough. For a moment, everything was still. No footsteps, no knocking, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd lost them, and then the lights flickered. My stomach dropped as the hallway plunged into brief darkness before the bulbs sputtered back to life. The sound of a door creaking open echoed from somewhere behind me. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me not to, but I had to know. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source of the noise. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the flickering light, was the animatronic Santa. It was standing in the doorway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Behind it, that shadowy figure lingered, its broad frame blending into the darkness. My heart felt like it might explode. "No, no, no," I whispered under my breath, clutching my bag as if it could somehow protect me. The Santa moved first. Its jerky, mechanical steps echoed through the hallway as it shuffled closer. Behind it, the figure moved more smoothly, like it was gliding. Panicked, without thinking, I bolted down the hallway, my shoes skidding against the slick floor. The narrow corridor twisted and turned, each step feeling like I was being chased through a maze. The sound of footsteps, two sets, one heavy and deliberate, the other unervingly light, followed me, growing louder with each turn. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Up ahead, I spotted a door marked maintenance. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, slipping inside and shutting it behind me as quietly as I could. The room was small and cramped, filled with shelves of cleaning supplies and equipment. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, my hand covering my mouth to stifle my breathing. I listened, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For a moment there was silence. Then, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging against the other side of the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tensing as the scraping grew louder, more insistent. "Please, just go," I thought, barely able to keep myself from shaking. The handle rattled. My heart sank. I bit down hard on my lip to keep from screaming as the handle twisted back and forth, like something was trying to figure out how to open it. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. I opened my eyes, cautiously, my ears straining for any hint of movement. For a moment, it seemed like they'd left. Then, a loud bang rattled the door. I jumped, my back slamming against the wall as the door shook violently. Whatever was out there wasn't going to give up. The pounding grew more aggressive, the metal door frame groaning under the pressure. Think, I whispered to myself, scanning the room for any kind of escape. That's when I noticed a vent near the ceiling. It was small, but I thought I might be able to squeeze through. I scrambled onto a nearby shelf, ignoring the way it wobbled under my weight. My fingers fumbled as I pried the vent cover off, the screws clattering onto the floor below. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there could sense I was trying to escape. I climbed into the vent, pulling myself up with shaking arms. It was tight, the metal cold against my skin, but I managed to fit. Just as I started crawling forward, the door to the maintenance room burst open. I froze, my body trembling as I looked back through the vent's slats. The animatronic Santa stood in the doorway, its head twitching erratically. Behind it, the shadowy figure loomed, its presence filling the small room. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't notice the open vent. The Santa's glassy eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. But then, its head snapped upward, its gaze locking onto the vent. "No!" I gasped, scrambling forward as fast as I could. The sound of metal bending filled the air as the Santa reached for the vent, its mechanical fingers clawing at the edges. I crawled faster, my knees and elbows scraping against the sharp metal. The vent shook violently, and I could hear the figure's heavy footsteps below, following my every move. Up ahead, I saw a faint light. It looked like an exit, and I pushed myself toward it with everything I had. Behind me, the vent groaned under the weight of something heavy. I didn't dare look back. Almost there, I whispered to myself, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, I reached the end of the vent. The cover wasn't screwed in, and I kicked it out with all my strength, tumbling out onto the floor of another hallway. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching but my adrenaline keeping me moving. The sound of the vent collapsing behind me sent a jolt of fear through my chest. They were still coming. I ran, my legs screaming in protest, until I reached a large metal door at the end of the hallway. It was labeled Emergency Exit. I pushed against it, but it didn't move. No, come on, I cried, slamming my hands against the door. The footsteps were getting closer, the echo of their approach filling the hallway. I spotted a fire alarm on the wall next to the door. Without thinking, I yanked it down. The shrill sound of the alarm blared through the mall, and to my surprise, the emergency door unlocked with a loud click. I shoved it open and stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. For a moment, I just stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. When I looked back at the door, it was shut again. The sound of the alarm faded into silence, and the parking lot around me was completely empty. But the feeling of being watched never left. I stood there in the freezing night air, my breath visible in the glow of the parking lot lights. My legs felt like they'd give out any second, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My ears still rang from the fire alarm, though the sound had faded into the distance. The mall loomed behind me, silent and still, but I knew better. Whatever had been inside with me, whatever had chased me through those narrow halls, it wasn't gone. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to dial Lisa's number. My hands were shaking so much it took 2 tries to press the right buttons. The call rang once, twice, then it went straight to voicemail. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the red button. What was I even going to say? "Hey, Lisa, the store's haunted, and your animatronic Santa tried to kill me?" Yeah, I'm sure that would go over great. I let the phone drop to my side and took a shaky step toward my car. The cold night air did little to calm the panic still buzzing under my skin. But as I reached my car, I noticed something that made me stop. My reflection in the driver's side window wasn't right. It wasn't moving with me. I froze, my chest tightening as I stared at the figure in the glass. It looked like me, wearing the same jacket, the same messy hair, but its expression was wrong. Its eyes were too wide, its smile too sharp. Then it raised its hand and waved. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The reflection didn't move, staying perfectly still in the glass, its smile growing wider as I backed away. "I need to leave," I whispered to myself. "Just get in the car and leave." I forced myself to look away from the window and climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't dare look at the glass again as I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. As I drove home, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. Every shadow on the road felt like it was moving, shifting, watching. My mind kept replaying the events of the night, the footsteps, the Santa, the thing in the security footage. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt like I'd run a marathon. I locked the door behind me and sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. I told myself I was safe now, but deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window, made my skin crawl. And when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with those glassy eyes and the sound of slow, mechanical footsteps. When I woke up the next morning, I found an email from Lisa waiting in my inbox. Thanks for covering last night. Hope it wasn't too boring. Quick question. Did you move the animatronic Santa? It wasn't where it's supposed to be this morning. Let me know. My stomach turned as I stared at the screen. I didn't reply, and I never went back to that store. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about what happened. I've tried convincing myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, a trick of the light or the stress of working late. But every time I close my eyes, I hear that knocking, and I see that reflection, still waving. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.